Hi, this is Christopher Perrin, and welcome to this episode of The Christopher Perrin Show. In this episode, I want to talk about the principles of good pedagogy. Principles are those ideas that enable us and liberate us to select the right teaching techniques in any given situation. So, in this episode, I want to talk about what it means to be a principled pedagogue. If you think about it, teaching techniques are like valuable pearls or tools. Take the technique of knowing how to ask students questions at the right time. Some people call this cold calling. Do you do cold calling? Do you know when to ask questions of particular students to keep them engaged and on alert that they might be required to give their response to an idea or a question? Well, that's a good technique, and good teachers either learn that on the job or they maybe are trained and shown how to do this before they even begin to teach. But what principles, what ideas would help you to select that teaching technique? Well, a good principle is like a string that organizes those pearls and enables you to call forth the right teaching technique in any given circumstance. So the problem with focusing too much on techniques without principles is that you become a kind of educational technician, and then you don't have the ability to know what to do and when it comes to teaching and pedagogy. So I want to talk about that today, and I'm going to give you some content from a book that I have co-written with Carrie Eben, another great classical educator that I've been so pleased to collaborate with. And we've written this book called The Good Teacher, 10 Key Principles of Pedagogy that will transform your teaching. And so over years of just doing staff training and talking with teachers and other great pedagogues much better than me, I've come to see how important principles are, because that's what these teachers think about and do and say. So over time, I, and with Carrie's help, have gathered these principles and articulated them in this book that's coming out in a few months. It's called The Good Teacher. So here's my thoughts about principles. In the classical tradition, education is not job training, but it's bringing up human beings, or it's the enculturation of human beings. Education, Plato says in the Republic, should teach students to love what is beautiful, and Aquinas states in his Summa Theologica that education should lead men to virtue and truth. And in the Christian tradition, education is needed for the sake of the true, good, and the beautiful as well, which all have their origin, the true, the good, and the beautiful do, in God, who is the author of them all. G.K. Chesterton says that education is simply the soul of society as it passes from one generation to another. He also says it's telling the truth to the last baby born. So it's general, it's cultural transmission, but it's also particular. It's telling truth, according to Chesterton. If education is cultural transmission and truth-telling, well, then what does it mean to be an excellent educator? Certainly it must mean cultivated affection for the beautiful, following Plato, and truth, following Aquinas, but it also means growing in virtue, which is another word for excellence or goodness. So here, I want to emphasize that to be a good pedagogue, you have to be a good person. A good teacher continues to assimilate all the virtue and wisdom from past generations, all that she can, and she seeks to pass it on to the next generation, as Chesterton says. A good teacher will sometimes be a muse who inspires, and at times even a worker of wonders, a wonder worker. She will sometimes be an instructor who explains, and often a guide who leads her students to discover and to see. But she will always be an educator who raises up and helps unfold and fill the souls of her students. She will be a model of goodness, and she'll be a good pedagogue. She will not be a classroom technician, but a person, a pedagogue of principle. So Carrie Eben, as I've said, and I have written this book called The Good Teacher, and it's not about techniques, but it's about principles that a good teacher uses to inform and select techniques, setting the teacher free to know what to teach, when, and how. A principle is a first thing. It's something, that's what the word means, from principis. It's a first thing. It's something that we should regard as primary, that guides the beginning of our work and aims it towards a purposeful end. One way to think about principles and how they are foundational to good teaching is to use an analogy. And the analogy that I'd like to use is the analogy of carpentry. A carpenter needs to learn how to use a variety of tools, including several kinds of hammers, saws, drills, and drivers for screws and fasteners of multiple types. I hope you have some fun power tools around your house. I do. I probably have more of them than I need. A carpenter's toolbox can be quite large, containing easily over 30 tools. And learning the technique for using each tool, remember how to strike a nail? Do you remember learning how to strike a nail? Can you strike a nail with a hammer? It's a technique. Learning how to use a hammer is important, but how does a carpenter know what tool to use? And if he discerns that he needs a hammer, how does he know which of about 20 different kinds of nails to use? Striking a nail is a necessary technique. Knowing that a hammer is needed is a principle. The carpenter, while selecting various tools on a project, is able to keep his mind on what it is that he's seeking to build. Yes, he has a plan and he begins with the end in mind, but he also is able to adapt depending on what he finds during the course of a project. Now, haven't you engaged in some kind of renovation project and you try to predict what's going to happen and you think you know generally, but you usually discover things, especially during the demolition process. So, carpenter is guided not just by techniques that he's mastered, but by principles of building. He knows how to adapt to what he finds and sees. So here are 4 key principles that carpenters do employ. The first is this: don't start with the roof. Okay, that's a bit of a joke. Maybe you've heard that. We build, carpenters do, from the ground up, and this aspect of reality is so obvious that it's never even stated. You're not going to find a carpenter say, well, the first thing I'm going to do is ensure that I don't start with the roof. I'm going to just write that down now. No, it's so obvious that you don't start with the roof. It would be folly and really impossible to ignore. But here's another principle: get the right material. Get the right material for the job at hand. Does this job require 2x4s or 1x6 boards? A combination of them? Will it require 4x4 posts or not? What kind of hardware will I need and how much? Get the right material for the job. Or how about this third principle: use the right tools for the job. Boy, that makes a difference, doesn't it? Will I need a hand saw, a table saw, circular saw, or a miter saw to cut these boards, or all 4 of those kinds of saws? How about a hammer, a level? And then there's this maxim that you've probably heard, this principle: measure twice, cut once, that carpenter's dictum. Carpenters learn how to measure a board with measuring tape and a carpenter's pencil, but most importantly, they also learn the value of measuring twice to ensure an accurate cut and prevent the wasting of valuable wood. These principles and others become so well known to a carpenter that they grow to become instinctive or intuitive. They're second nature, as it were. They guide and liberate the carpenter to do good work, to know what to do and when, making him or her a good carpenter. Techniques or particular skills must be mastered, of course, but principles govern the use of these skills. This harmony of skill and principles characterizes all trades and professions: good gardeners, good web designers, good chefs, good chemists, good mechanics, good business owners, and good teachers. Carpentry is a practical art, and so is teaching. Teachers will plan and build from the ground up. Scaffolding learning. Often you hear this metaphor used in educational circles and teacher circles. Scaffolding learning. It's a carpentry metaphor, isn't it? And they know how very well to adapt to foreseen and unforeseen circumstances. They will make wide use of published materials like a published text, For a teacher, a published text will serve them, but will not rule over them, any more than a principled carpenter would become the slave to a set of instructions, especially if they came from a foreign country and were translated into English. Carpenters are best trained by other carpenters, and so are teachers best trained by other teachers. Teaching is a cooperative art. To learn the principles of teaching is to learn the craft or art of teaching. And as an art, teaching is rooted in principles that are prudently applied to varying circumstances and varying human beings, because those children differ child to child. It is certainly not a hard science like physics, in which the same input will result in the same output every time. Although, to be fair, education can be informed by science, but it is not itself a science. Gilbert Hyatt, a professor of classical studies at Columbia University in the mid-20th century, witnessed the increasingly popular claims by progressive educators that teaching was or should be a science. In fact, if you have an education degree, it's a BS, it's a Bachelor of Science. He challenged that thesis in his book entitled The Art of Teaching. And here's what he says near the beginning of that book. Teaching is not a science, it is an art. The instinctive, dynamic, and unpredictable elements in teaching make it far more like an art than a science. Science is precise, predictable, and follows laws that can be tested and measured. But teaching involves the interaction of personalities, the inspiration of the teacher, and the active participation of the student, which cannot be reduced to a set of fixed rules. So writes Gilbert Hyatt. Not only is teaching an art, but it's a cooperative art. Hyatt has just said that it involves the active participation of a student. The teacher must model, instruct, and train, but the student must observe, attend, imitate, and practice. A student has a say in whether or not he will learn anything. If the student does not choose to learn for himself, he will not, nor will he retain much, no matter what threats or rewards might be employed to make him learn. If he does not cooperate with the teacher by choosing to learn, not much after that can be accomplished. And if you're a teacher, you know this. You can, with threats and punishments and rewards and so forth, move students through steps. But what you are unable to get them to do, they usually forget quite quickly because they don't want to learn. And their participation and their desire matters. This is why, in various ways, the teacher seeks to inspire and persuade the student to love the art, skill, discipline, or subject that is placed before him. Because if a student learns to love what it is you teach, they'll retain it and become their own student of that subject, even when you're not around. The carpenter does not begin his work with the roof, but he does begin his work with the roof in mind. He knows that what his pinnacle will be. The teacher is not able to begin his work teaching a student who is mature, but he does have the mature, educated student in mind, the person that student will become later, is in the mind of the teacher. He begins, the teacher does, on the ground, as it were, with the student, as that student is before him, immature, but full of potential to become mature. If teaching is an art and a cooperative art, then teaching begins with the teacher. She must invite her students to attend and imitate her. A teacher who no longer is learning simply will not inspire her students, for she has stopped being a student herself. She will likely become a technician rather than an artist, her own love and wonder having diminished or possibly vanished. The teacher, however, who remains a student, will regularly display her own delight in growing in knowledge herself. She will all the more delight in the growth of her students when she sees them learning. The first great principle of teaching is this: I keep learning. I always remain a student. It becomes essentially her philosophy of teaching. A good teacher is not just a model of lifelong learning, but also a model of virtue. She essentially stands before her class and she says, "Do as I do, be as I am, love what I love." My conviction is that virtue can be taught, but it's primarily caught. It has to be modeled. It's seeing the delight, the radiant love and joy and wonder on the face of a teacher that really pulls and attracts students into the subject matter, the art or the ideas, but it's through the countenance of another wondrous human being. In Luke 6:39-40, Christ says, "Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher." Well, we have all been formed and become, therefore, like our teachers. It's a sobering thought that the teacher not only instructs and imparts knowledge, but models a way of being, thinking, and acting. The student doesn't merely come to know what his teacher knows. He becomes what his teacher is. How then will a student grow in virtue? By following his leader, if his leader is virtuous. Yes, the teacher is one of the chief living models that inspires students. Now, so are parents, so are community leaders, so are aunts and uncles, so are fellow students, so are pastors, so are all kinds of people in the student's life. But the teacher is a particularly important living model of virtue that inspires students, what Chesterton called the star-appointed priestess at once of democracy and tradition. The good teacher, therefore, leads students to wonder about things that are true, good, and beautiful, and directs their gaze to things that inspire virtue. Students will first notice virtue in the way the adults around them live, and will note the differences between how we live and what we teach and say. They're very good at noting those differences. Students will find hope and courage even as they hear of the teacher's struggles to grow in virtue, to display courage herself to grow in virtue, seeing that growth in virtue is a lifelong process because it's still active and present in their teachers. Every key principle of pedagogy provides an occasion for the teacher to model virtue, because each of the key principles of pedagogy not only require virtue in teachers as they live them out in their lives, but also because the principles develop virtues and virtue in their students. After all, good education is encircled by virtue and has virtue at its core, for virtue arguably is the beginning and the end of education, and in the Christian tradition, holiness and piety as well. Virtue means human excellence. It begins with the virtue of the teacher, and it ends with the virtue cultivated in her students. If education is formation in virtue, then good teachers seek to form virtue in students always throughout the entire course of study. It's always present. Having said this, we can benefit greatly from paying attention to the various principles of teaching that have guided teachers for centuries. And that's what Carrie Eben and I attempt to do in the book, The Good Teacher, is to go through 10 key principles and articulate and try to unfold how important they are for developing good teaching in the classroom and everywhere. If you're growing in goodness and virtue personally, then applying these principles will serve you greatly and, I believe, transform your teaching, as it did for countless teachers in past ages. So when we speak of a good teacher, we have at least two primary meanings in mind. First, we have in mind that a good teacher is someone who is himself a virtuous good person that students will want to imitate and will imitate. Secondly, we have in mind, when we say good teacher, a teacher who is good at the craft of teaching, who demonstrates lifelong learning. Quintilian, the Roman educator and orator, said that a good orator was a good man. a good man speaking well. The virtue of the orator was intrinsically important to Quintilian. A good teacher is a good person teaching well. She's a good student herself, a good model of ongoing wonder and learning, but she's also good at the craft or the principles of teaching. She is a good model and a good pedagogue. In our view, this is the proper order. Seek to be a good human being, then seek to be a good pedagogue. The first should lead the second. Now, in the classical tradition, there's pedagogy, but there's also psychagogy. Pedagogy is, of course, leading a child. Pais pedos in Greek means child, and then agein in Greek means to lead. So, literally speaking, pedagogy is to lead a child somewhere, to guide, to take them somewhere. And psychagogy is to lead a soul. So we teach a soul and we lead a soul. Education classically has meant the cultivation of forming of a person. This belief that education is human formation has been called Platonic, it's been called Aristotelian, Augustinian, it's been called musical education, ancient education, medieval, traditional, liberal, classical, and Christian education, because it can be and often is all these things. So then, what is a classical Christian educator forming young people to be? How should a student be cultivated? To answer this question, let's begin with such an educator's beliefs about people, that is, her anthropology. The educator holds a classical view of what humans are, what they seek, what they need, what they're capable of. She holds a classical anthropology. She believes they have a soul and reason that is capable of knowing the true, appreciating the beautiful, and doing the good. She knows humans can grow, develop, and get better even as they're thwarted by passion, appetite, and vice. She believes that there are real standards of human excellence and that some things can be better than others. She believes in the reality of justice, the goodness of courage, the wonder of beauty, and the satisfaction of truth. She's a realist. She's a metaphysical and moral realist, to use some philosophical terms. The classical educator believes also that truth exists and can be known. She believes that beauty is real and can be engaged. She believes that goodness is real and that humans can aspire to and become good. She believes that there are dispositions of character such as justice, prudence, temperance, courage, studiousness, humility, attention, and diligence, and that they can be fostered in a student. She believes that what students encounter as young children impress them deeply and create affections and tastes that can last a lifetime. So what we do with young children is critically important. She believes, as Aristotle did, that all learning is motivated by and starts with wonder. That's how Aristotle begins his book, Metaphysics. She herself remains aware of her ignorance that is mixed with astonishment. She delights in stoking the wonder of her students and seeing them become internally motivated to seek to know, experience, and understand. Whatever your anthropology is, it governs your teaching. If humans are mainly workers who are to be trained to perform various jobs, which will enable them to live well in the real world and achieve economic success, well, then teaching will serve that end. The way one philosopher puts it, Jamie Smith, he says, every pedagogy assumes an anthropology. If humans exist to pursue their whims and pleasures however they choose, then teaching will follow suit. If humans are regarded as advanced machines or animals that can be controlled and programmed to the preferred behaviors of those in charge, then teaching will entail a great deal of control and programming techniques, conditioning, you might say. Progressive, modern education is informed by a mix of these anthropologies and their paired pedagogies. Many of us have encountered these in our own schooling, even if we did not have the vocabulary to describe them with great sophistication. In contrast, the classical Christian educator holds to the tradition that believes passionately that students should learn to live well in the real world, but that the real world is one in which the true, good, and beautiful not only exist, but are knowable by the minds that God has given us. The cosmos we live in is beautiful, but its beauty is ordered that way by the Creator, God. Thus we should strive to become a microcosm, a small ordered cosmos of beauty in ourselves. The cosmos means ordered beauty. As we engage it, as we delight in it, as we wonder at it, as we contemplate it, reflect it in some way such that we might call ourselves a microcosmos, a small cosmos, that we might become ordered beauty ourselves. And teachers should help students also to order their lives and their loves in a beautiful, ordered way. In other words, to cultivate virtue. If a good teacher's aim is to form his students, and foster virtue in them, and if virtue is the beginning and the end of education, then we ought to be certain we know just what virtue is. The tradition of virtue ethics is long and robust and deep, and it can be traced back at least to Aristotle and his Nicomachean Ethics. And we cannot fully explicate this robust tradition here, but I can try to summarize it briefly. Vir in Latin means man. Virtus means to come into one's own as a vir, as a man. It can mean manly, as in courage and bravery, but it also simply means excellent, as having fully developed human capacity and skill. To the Roman mind, a man could be virtuous, excellent, at sailing, playing the lute, cooking, combat, or ruling or governing a city. In English, we retain the sense of great excellence in our word virtuoso. It's got vir right there in it, which refers to a person of the greatest skill or excellence in a particular craft, as in a virtuoso violinist. Though vir and virtus are masculine in Latin, the principle incorporates all humans, male and female. To grow in virtue, then, is to grow as a human being, to learn to do what humans can do, and to do those things with excellence. If we define education in the classical tradition as a process by which humans are trained and cultivated to become virtuous, then it includes not only formal schooling, but any means by which the more mature, like parents, teachers, mentors, friends, help the younger to grow and mature in virtue. One will not become a virtuoso pianist without a teacher who models and trains. Nor is this modeling alone sufficient. The student must initiate and practice, and I might add, love the piano. Remember, teaching is a cooperative art. This imitation and practice we can call habit formation. Students develop habits, and those habits become the home, the habitation in which their character lives. The virtues have been organized in various ways that describe human experience and behavior. There are various lists and taxonomies of them, and they vary, and there's no one list that is final. There are the moral virtues, the intellectual or academic virtues, civic virtues, and there are physical and spiritual virtues as well. Various kinds of excellencies that can characterize a human being. The way of organizing them can vary, and there are sometimes two or more names for the same virtue. Here's a basic list for you. First, the moral or cardinal virtues. Moral virtues are those that describe general, universal human behaviors, how we relate to one another as fellow human beings and as neighbors. The cardinal virtues are so named because they're regarded as master virtues that subsume within themselves other kinds of minor virtues. Cardinal comes from cardo cardinus, which means hinge. Not the bird. The bird is actually named after the Roman Catholic cardinal who wears red, because the cardinal is red. And why were the Roman Catholic cardinals called cardinals and still called cardinals? Well, because they were the leaders of the church. They are hinges of the church. Why did they wear red? Because they were prepared to shed their blood as martyrs for the church. But cardo cardinus means hinge. So these cardinal virtues are hinge virtues. These virtues are regarded as those key virtues on which a man's moral life hinges and revolves. Because these cardinal virtues are so key, they are often present in other specific areas of human behavior. For example, the cardinal virtues of temperance and fortitude also appear as intellectual virtues. But here are the 4 cardinal virtues. Prudence, seeing what is real and knowing what to do in varying circumstances. Justice, after seeing what is real, giving to each person what is his or her due. Temperance, after seeing what is real, curbing our passions and appetites that would prevent us from just action. Courage or fortitude, after seeing what is real, overcoming threats and suffering to endure what is needed to engage in just action. Then there were the intellectual or academic virtues. Intellectual virtues are those virtues that pertain to learning and to study. All of us have a need to learn, and so these qualities describe a human who knows how to learn and learns well. Here's a list for you. Love and wonder. Gratitude to be in the world and a spirit of wonder and admiration for the cosmos. Studium, zeal, or inquisitiveness. That's three words or names for the same essential virtue. Studium meant, in Latin, zeal to know the true, the good. A zeal and thirst to know and understand, a healthy spirit of curiosity about how the world works. Then there's humility or docility, a recognition of one's ignorance and a willingness and desire to be taught by those who know more than we do. Diligence or constancy, a love-compelled study that stays on task and resists distraction. Attentiveness, propelled by a thirst to know something true, good, and beautiful, the mind of the student stretches out to grasp, know, and possess. Discipline or thoroughness, a disposition and habit to do work carefully and all the way to its conclusion. Courage and tenacity, the disposition to face academic difficulties that may at first be daunting and to overcome them with perseverance and necessary help. Temperance, moderated, prudent use of time and energy to do academic work, neither understudying nor overstudying, because each of those is a vice. Understudying is a vice. Sometimes we call it laziness. Overstudying is also a vice. Responsibility, the disposition that realizes that all deep learning must be done by the student, who decides to learn for herself and cooperates with her teacher. Then there were there are civic and citizenship virtues. These are virtues that pertain to our lives as fellow citizens in a city or a country so that we can live together with as much harmony and peace as possible. So here some of the cardinal virtues also appear. Prudence or practical wisdom is a civic virtue, making informed, sensible decisions based on good knowledge or civic circumstances and concerns of them. Justice or fairness in dealing with others, sharing resources, and respecting the rights of others. Temperance, moderation of desires, actions, and consumption of resources. Courage and fortitude, standing up for the rights of others and doing what is right for the good of others. Responsibility or accountability, maintaining one's commitments and property, staying informed. Civic-mindedness, showing concern for other citizens and taking action for the common good. Honesty, exhibiting truthfulness and reliability in dealing with others, say in commerce. Care, showing concern for the welfare of neighbors and other citizens. And loyalty, showing fidelity and commitment to work for the welfare of the community. So there are the moral virtues, the cardinal virtues, there are the academic or intellectual virtues, and they're civic virtues, all varying forms of human excellence. But there's more. Just to finish our survey, there are physical virtues as well. We might as well note them because let's note them. A person can be excellent in body, mind, and spirit. And since humans are integrated beings consisting of immaterial and material parts, body and soul, our souls, or bodies too, rather, should be cultivated in the virtues proper to them. Educators in the classical tradition believe that exercising the body benefited the mind and the spirit too, since humans are enfleshed spirits. One maxim was this: anima sana in corpore sanus. Anima sana in corpore sanus meant in Latin a sound mind in a sound body. And by the way, the first letters form A6. Yes, the shoe company is based on this Latin maxim, anima sana in corpore sanus. And here are the traditional physical or bodily virtues: speed and swiftness, strength, endurance, agility and coordination, grace, and health. In the classical tradition, the training of the body was paired with the cultivation of the soul. It was understood that bodily strength and control contributed to intellectual development, since human beings were body-soul unities. And then finally, we'll round out our survey by looking at the theological, spiritual, or supernatural virtues. These virtues were added to the traditional list that I've already mentioned after the advent of Christianity, and appear famously in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 13, in which Paul concludes, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love." These spiritual virtues describe the disposition of the Christian to readily trust in the promises of God, retain hope for the goodness of God despite suffering and trial, and love God and neighbor in and through every action and activity. As supernatural virtues, they partake of God's grace and manifest the very presence of Christ in a way that can appear surprising and even paradoxical, because they're supernatural. They aren't always understood very well, humanly speaking. Chesterton describes the paradoxical nature of the theological virtues this way in an essay that's in his book, Heretics. Here's what he says: "As the word unreasonable is open to misunderstanding, the matter may be more accurately put by saying that each one of these Christian or mystical virtues involves a paradox in its own nature, and that this is not true of any of the typically pagan or rationalist virtues, like the cardinal virtues. Justice consists in finding out a certain thing due to a certain man and giving it to him. Temperance consists in finding out the proper limit of a particular indulgence and adhering to that. But charity or love means pardoning what is unpardonable, or it is no virtue at all. Hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it is no virtue at all. And faith means believing the incredible, or it is no virtue at all." So writes Chesterton. Here's a more straightforward definition of each of these theological virtues. Faith, the virtue that connects us to God, assents to and trusts in His revealed truth and promises in Scripture. Hope, seeing past present circumstances, this virtue desires and expects the blessedness and happiness of life with and in God. Love or charity, the virtue that unites oneself with the love of God and participates in that love, animating all activity and action. Growing in love, this virtue gives power and effectiveness to all other virtues. After all, Paul says the greatest of these three is love. Love for the Christian is the virtue of virtues. that virtue that should govern all that the Christian does, including studying, learning, and teaching. Augustine writes that even the four cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, courage, he says even these four cardinal virtues for the Christian should be transformed into forms of love. He writes this way: "For these four virtues I should have no hesitation in defining them, that temperance is love, giving itself entirely to that which is loved. Fortitude is love readily bearing all things for the sake of the loved object. Justice is love serving only the loved object and therefore ruling rightly. And prudence is love distinguishing with sagacity between what hinders it and what helps it." A good teacher, therefore, models virtue and carefully participates in the formation of character in his students, but he is also good at teaching. So I hope to talk more about the principles of teaching, but here I can just name them for you, and in the future maybe tease them out in future episodes. But let me lay out the 10 pedagogical principles that I think are really worth understanding and contemplating in order to teach well. The first is festina lente, make haste slowly, or master each step. The second is multum non multa, which means much, not many. It's better to do a deep dive in fewer things than do a superficial coverage of a lot of things that will likely be forgotten. Number 3, repetitio mater memoriae. Repetition is the mother of memory. The principle that says we should come back and review and revisit those things which we want to possess permanently. Songs, chants, and jingles, which says that we should sing delightfully, especially with younger children, in order to engage and remember and love the things that are true, good, and beautiful. Wonder and curiosity, that principle that says we should pause and be at wonder and let our spirit of inquiry grow. Schole and contemplation, which says we should create conditions in which we can actually be at wonder, find times to contemplate, and have great discussion with our friends and teachers about the things that are most important. And then embodied learning, number 7. There are two aspects to this, the liturgical and the poetic, which means that we learn how to use our bodies as great channels by which we come to know and engage anything that's true, good, and beautiful. And number 8, docendo discimus, which means by teaching we learn, that principle that says if you really want to learn something well, teach it to someone else, even if you're a student. And then optimus magister bonus liber est, which in Latin means the best teacher is a good book. This principle that we always are curating, gathering, and presenting, and teaching, and discussing the best books we can find with our students. And then finally, conversation and friendship, that principle that says all teaching occurs in the context of a relationship, and it should be one of fellowship, sympathy, and friendship. These 10 principles are all interrelated. As in an ecosystem, every part is in a dynamic relationship with every other part. Imagine discounting the role that the sun or the soil or the water has in some biological ecosystem. We would and could not, as each of these bear on one another and each bears on the whole. Observe, for example, the relationship between multum non multa and contemplation. Multum non multa asserts that it's best to study a few things deeply and well rather than to study many things superficially. Does this not lead naturally to contemplation? It's very difficult to contemplate something true, good, and beautiful if you're always hurrying to study the next thing before really contemplating and mastering what's before you. This naturally intersects with yet another principle, festina lente, or make haste slowly, which asserts that it's better to master each step before moving on to the next. So we see that at least these 3 principles, multum non multa, contemplation, and festina lente, are in a vibrant relationship with each other. And what's remarkable is that this is true of all of these pedagogical principles. They are not discrete and unrelated. They are continuous and interrelated, and any one of them will naturally lead to the others. All these principles in various ways complement one another and can be combined. This means that as we teach and employ them, any one of these principles can lead and suggest another. It also means that the boundary lines between them are porous and light. I believe that if you study these principles, you will find yourself moving from whole to part to whole, and from part to part, just as we do when we study anything in the cosmos. I hope that this has been of some encouragement to you, some help to you, and I would encourage you as well to go to my Substack, which is christopherperrin.substack.com, where I have some additional articles and some podcasts on some of these principles. There'll be more coming. And of course, the book is coming, The Good Teacher, in about 3 or 4 months. I think it'll be ready in May of 2025. So if you're listening to this and it's past that time, take a look at classicalacademicpress.com. You can take a look at that book. You can read a sample before you buy. I should also say that Carrie Eben and I will be shortly recording a course on The Good Teacher, where we will present on all 10 of these principles that are in the book. It'll be recorded in January of 2025 and probably available by May of 2025. So if you're interested in studying these principles by viewing the course and maybe reading the book together, possibly with some other teachers, take a look at that course when it's available on classicalu.com. At this point, I just want to thank you for what you're doing as an educator. It's an important and difficult labor. It's a labor of love. Thank you for that, and thank you for your kind time and attention. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to the Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at classicalacademicpress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.